"You seem lost, stranger. Want to meet my pa?" asked the boy to a Sioux woman at the settler's stop. She didn't expect what came next, a journey that would transform a blood-soaked warrior into something she never thought possible, and reveal secrets that would shake the very foundations of everything she believed about survival, redemption, and the true meaning of home. The autumn wind of 1876 cut through the Dakota territory like a blade fresh from the forge, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and the promise of a winter that would show no mercy. 3 miles east of Fort Laramie, where the Oregon Trail split like a serpent's tongue toward California and Oregon, sat Henderson's Stop, a ramshackle collection of weathered buildings that served as the last refuge for travelers before the treacherous mountain passes ahead. The main building, part trading post and part saloon, leaned against the wind like an old man fighting sleep, its wooden walls scarred by bullets from raids, storms, and the general lawlessness that plagued the frontier.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Smoke drifted from the crooked chimney, mixing with the dust kicked up by a freight wagon that had arrived just before dawn. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete Donovan, sat slumped against his wagon wheel, nursing a bottle of whiskey and a bullet wound in his thigh that hadn't been properly cleaned in 3 days. His cargo barrels of salt pork, ammunition, and winter supplies remained untouched in the wagon bed, too valuable to unload without proper protection, too dangerous to leave unguarded in a place where desperate men gathered like vultures. Around Carrion, the settlement around Henderson's Stop consisted of maybe 24 souls, most of them running from something or someone. There was Martha Henderson, the proprietor's wife, who kept a loaded shotgun behind the bar and had buried 3 husbands in 5 years. Her current husband, Big Jim Henderson, stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed nearly 300 pounds. But everyone knew Martha was the one who really ran the place. Their son, 8-year-old Ethan Burke Henderson, had inherited his mother's keen eyes and his father's fearless nature, a combination that made him both endearing and dangerous in equal measure. The other residents included Doc Slattery, a disgraced army surgeon who'd been discharged for drunkenness, but whose steady hands had saved more lives than his drinking had cost. Sarah McKinney, a widow who ran the boarding house and took in laundry while raising her twin daughters alone. And various Pete, so named because he claimed to have been various professions in various places, though nobody believed half his stories. There were also the drifters, the gamblers, the men with no names who paid in gold dust and never stayed longer than a week. On this particular morning, as the sun struggled to burn through the gray clouds that hung low over the prairie, young Ethan Burke sat on the porch steps of the trading post, whittling a piece of pine with a knife his father had given him for his 8th birthday. His blonde hair stuck up in unruly cowlicks despite his mother's attempts to tame it with water and pomade, and his blue eyes missed nothing that moved within a mile of the settlement. He had the peculiar ability that some frontier children developed, the skill of seeing danger before it announced itself, of reading the land and the people on it, like words in his mother's Bible. The boy noticed her first as a dark speck against the eastern horizon, moving slowly across the prairie like a wounded animal seeking shelter. At first glance, she appeared to be just another traveler, perhaps a trader or a settler who had become separated from a wagon train. But as she drew closer, Ethan's sharp eyes picked out details that made his breath catch in his throat. The way she moved with the fluid grace of a predator despite obvious injuries. The cut of her buckskin clothing that marked her as Native American, and most telling of all, the rifle she carried with the easy familiarity of someone who had used it many times before. Chenoa White Dove approached Henderson's Stop like a ghost emerging from a nightmare. Blood had dried in dark patches on her torn buckskin dress, and her long black hair hung in tangled strands across her face, partially obscuring features that would have been beautiful if not for the haunted emptiness in her dark eyes. She limped, badly, favoring her left leg, and her right arm hung at an awkward angle that suggested a dislocated shoulder. But it was not her physical wounds that marked her most clearly, it was something deeper. Something that had been broken inside her spirit and left raw and bleeding. She had been walking for 4 days since the massacre at Crow Creek. 4 days since she had watched her entire war party die in an ambush that should never have succeeded. 4 days since she had failed in her duty as a scout and brought death down upon the warriors who had trusted her judgment. The memories played in her mind like a cruel song that would not stop, the crack of rifle fire from the rocks above, the screams of horses and men, the sight of her brother, many horses falling with a bullet through his chest while she lay hidden in the sagebrush. Too wounded to help, too cowardly to die with honor alongside her people. The war party had been returning from a successful raid against a cavalry supply train when they rode into the trap. Chenoa had been scouting ahead, following what appeared to be the tracks of a wounded deer when the shooting started. She had turned her horse and raced back toward the sound of battle, but a rifle shot from the rocks above had knocked her from her mount and sent her tumbling into a ravine filled with thorny brush. By the time she had crawled back to where she could see the fighting, it was over. 15 warriors lay dead among the rocks, their bodies already being stripped by the white soldiers who had set the ambush she had watched from her hiding place as the soldiers took scalps and collected weapons, had listened to their laughter as they joked about the easy victory. Their leader, a captain with sergeant's stripes and eyes like chips of winter ice, had walked among the bodies systematically shooting any warrior who still showed signs of life. When he came to many horses who had been trying to crawl toward his rifle despite the hole in his chest, the captain had paused and said something that made the other soldiers laugh before putting a bullet through her brother's head. That night, after the soldiers had made camp a mile away, Chenoa had crept back to gather what she could from the dead. She had found her brother's medicine bag, his war paint, and the silver cross their mother had given him when the missionaries came to their village years before. She had wanted to stay and sing the death songs, to prepare the bodies properly for their journey to the spirit world, but the soldiers had left sentries and she could not risk being discovered. So she had whispered the sacred words as quietly as she could, and then disappeared into the darkness, carrying her shame and sorrow like stones in her heart. Now she walked toward the white man's settlement with no clear purpose except the animal instinct to find shelter before her strength gave out completely. She knew the danger a lone Sioux woman approaching a frontier outpost in the aftermath of Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn was asking for a rope around her neck or worse. But the alternative was dying alone on the prairie. And despite everything that had happened, despite the shame that ate at her like acid, she was not yet ready to surrender her life to the crows and coyotes Ethan watched her approach with the fascination of a child who had grown up on stories of Indian raids and cavalry charges, but had never seen the reality up close. His father had fought in the war between the states and had told him that all enemies looked different when you saw them as people instead of monsters, but this was the first time Ethan had the chance to test that wisdom. What he saw was not the savage demon from his nightmares, but a woman who looked like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, who moved with the slow determination of someone who had forgotten how to hope but had not yet learned how to quit. The boy glanced toward the trading post, where he could hear his mother's voice mixing with the deeper tones of the men who had gathered for their morning whiskey and conversation. He knew he should call out, should alert the adults to the approaching stranger who might represent danger to their small community. But something in the woman's posture, in the way she held herself despite her obvious pain, made him hesitate. She did not move like someone preparing for attack. She moved like someone who had already been defeated and was simply looking for a place to fall down. When Chenoa was still 50 yards away, she stopped and raised her good hand in a gesture of peace, palm forward, fingers spread wide. It was a universal sign among the Plains tribes, one that even white settlers had learned to recognize.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
She called out in heavily accented English, "I come in peace. I seek no trouble. Only water and shelter for one night." Her voice carried across the morning air like the cry of a wounded bird, proud despite its pain, dignified despite its desperation. Ethan stood up from the porch steps, his whittling forgotten, and took several steps toward her. He was young enough not to fully understand the implications of what he was about to do, innocent enough to respond to suffering with compassion rather than suspicion. "You seem lost, stranger," he called back, his boy's voice high and clear in the thin air. "Want to meet my pa?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning a chasm, simple words that carried the weight of possibility and danger in equal measure. Chenoa stared at the child, the small white boy who showed no fear, who offered help instead of hostility. And for the first moment in 4 days, she felt something other than despair. She nodded slowly, not trusting herself to speak, and took another limping step forward. But before either of them could move further, the door of the trading post burst open and Big Jim Henderson emerged, his massive frame filling the doorway like a mountain blocking the sun. Behind him came Doc Slattery, Various Pete, and 2 other men whose names Chenoa did not know but whose intentions she could read clearly in their faces. Big Jim held a shotgun in his hands, not quite pointing it at her but making sure she could. "See it clearly, Ethan. Get away from there," Big Jim commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had learned to make quick decisions in dangerous situations. "Come back to the porch, son, now." The boy looked from his father to the wounded woman and back again, confusion and concern warring in his young features. He had been taught to obey his parents without question, but he had also been taught to help those in need, and the conflict between these 2 lessons left him frozen in place. Martha Henderson appeared in the doorway behind her husband, wiping her hands on her apron, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a woman who had survived on the frontier by learning to read situations accurately and act decisively. She could see the blood on the stranger's clothing, the way she favored her left leg, the exhaustion that made her sway slightly even while standing still. More importantly, she could see that the woman's rifle remained slung across her back, that her hands were raised in peace, that despite being armed, she had made no aggressive moves. "Jim," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying the tone she used when she wanted to be heard without seeming to challenge her husband's authority in front of the other men. "Look at her. She's more dead than alive. Whatever trouble she might have caused, she's in no condition to cause it now." She stepped forward slightly, positioning herself where she could see both the stranger and her son. "Ethan, come here to your mama, but walk slow and keep your hands where she can see them. No sudden moves." Chenoa raised both hands now, despite the pain it caused in her injured shoulder. "I mean no harm to the boy or to any of you," she said, speaking slowly and clearly so there could be no misunderstanding. "I am alone. I am wounded. I ask only for water and a place to rest before I continue my journey." She could see the suspicion in their faces, could feel the tension that crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. But she held her ground with the dignity of a warrior who had faced death many times before. Doc Slattery stepped forward, his medical instincts overriding his caution. Even from a distance, he could see that the woman was seriously injured, and his oath as a physician, however tarnished by drink and circumstance, still meant something to him. "Jim," he said quietly, "she's hurt bad. Look at the way she's holding that arm. And that blood on her leg. She's been bleeding for a while. She's not here to cause trouble. She's here because she's dying." Various Pete spat into the dust and shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Could be a trick," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Could be more of them out there waiting for us to let our guard down. Indians are clever that way. Send in a woman or a child to make us think we're safe, then hit us when we ain't expecting it. He had fought in the Indian Wars and had seen enough deception and betrayal to make him suspicious of any act of apparent vulnerability. The standoff stretched for long seconds, each person calculating risks and possibilities, weighing compassion against survival, duty against humanity. The wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the open ground between the settlement and the lone figure of Chenoa White Dove. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled above the prairie, and the sound seemed to emphasize the isolation and danger of their situation. In that moment of suspended time, young Ethan Burke made a decision that would change all their lives. He walked forward another 10 steps, bringing himself within arm's reach of the Sioux woman, and extended his small hand toward her. "My name's Ethan," he said simply. "What's yours?" Chenoa looked down at the boy's outstretched hand, at the open face that showed no hatred or fear, only curiosity and kindness. She had killed men twice his age without hesitation, had ridden with war parties that had burned homesteads and taken scalps, had earned her name as White Dove through acts of courage and violence that would have made grown warriors proud. But in this moment, faced with a child's innocent offer of friendship, she felt something crack inside her chest, some wall that had been built from years of warfare and loss. "Chenoa," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "My name is Chenoa White Dove." She reached out with her good hand and gently touched the boy's fingers, marveling at how small and soft they were, how different from the calloused hands of warriors and the hard grip of weapons. For a heartbeat, the two of them stood connected. Across the divide of race and culture and history, a wounded woman and an innocent child finding common ground in this simple human need for connection. The touch between Ethan and Chenoa lasted only a moment before Big Jim's voice cut through the morning air like the crack of a whip. "That's enough," he said, his tone carrying the finality of a man who had made his decision. "Ethan, step away from her now. Doc, you want to help her, you can do it from over here. I'm not having my boy used as a shield by some desperate Indian." The massive man took 3 deliberate steps forward, his shotgun now clearly visible but still not directly aimed at the wounded woman. Chenoa released the boy's hand and took a careful step backward, understanding the delicate nature of the situation. She had been in enough dangerous encounters to know when men were balanced on the knife's edge between mercy and violence, and she could see that Big Jim Henderson was trying to be reasonable while still protecting his family. "The boy is in no danger from me," she said clearly, her English carrying only the slightest accent, despite the pain that made her words come slowly. "I give you my word as a warrior of the Lakota people." Various Pete snorted derisively at this declaration. "Word of a warrior," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's rich, coming from someone whose people just massacred Custer and his whole command at Little Bighorn. How do we know she wasn't part of that slaughter? How do we know she's not here scouting for another attack?" His hand moved closer to his pistol grip, and Chenoa could see the hatred burning in his eyes like a coal that had been banked, but never allowed to die completely. Doc Slattery moved between Various Pete and the wounded woman, his medical bag appearing in his hand, as if by magic. Despite his reputation for drinking, his movements were steady and purposeful when confronted with someone who needed his skills. "Pete, you're letting your prejudices cloud your judgment," he said firmly. "Look at her with a doctor's eyes instead of a soldier's. She's got a dislocated shoulder, a deep laceration on her left thigh that's been bleeding for days, and she's showing signs of exhaustion and dehydration. If she was here to scout for an attack, she'd be in a lot better shape than this." Martha. Henderson had been studying the stranger with the calculating gaze of a woman who had learned to read people's intentions by watching their eyes and the way they held their bodies. What she saw was not the cold calculation of a scout or spy, but something much more complex and troubling, a deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, a kind of spiritual emptiness that reminded her of soldiers she had seen returning from battles they wished they could forget. "Jim," she said quietly, "let Doc look at her. But we do it out here in the open, where everyone can see what's happening." Big Jim considered his wife's words, knowing that Martha's instincts about people were usually more reliable than his own. After a long moment, he nodded once. "All right, Doc, you can tend to her, but she keeps her hands where we can see them, and that rifle stays exactly where it is. First sign of trouble, any kind of trouble at all, and this conversation ends permanently." He shifted his grip on the shotgun to emphasize his point. Though his finger remained outside the trigger guard, Shenoa carefully lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the dust with her injured arm cradled against her body. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her shoulder and leg, but she bit down on any sound that might be interpreted as weakness or deception. She had learned long ago that showing vulnerability to enemies could be fatal, though she was no longer certain whether these white settlers should be considered enemies or simply people trying to survive in a harsh and unforgiving land. "Doc." Slattery approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'm going to need to examine that shoulder," he said, speaking directly to Shenoa. "It's going to hurt when I manipulate it, but I need to see how badly it's dislocated before I can put it back in place. Can you understand what I'm telling you?" His voice carried the professional calm of a man who had treated hundreds of injuries during his years as an army surgeon. "I understand," Shenoa replied, meeting his eyes directly. "I have set bones before, for my own people. I know what must be done." She began to carefully work her good arm out of the sleeve of her buckskin dress, revealing the extent of the damage. To her shoulder, the joint was visibly out of place, swollen and discolored, and Doc Slattery could see that it had been that way for several days. The fact that she had been walking and functioning with such an injury spoke to either exceptional toughness or desperate necessity. Young Ethan had retreated to his mother's side as instructed, but his eyes never left the wounded woman. There was something about her that fascinated him beyond the simple novelty of meeting a real Indian. Perhaps it was the way she held herself with dignity despite her obvious pain, or the sadness in her eyes that reminded him of the look his mother got sometimes when she thought no one was watching. "Ma," he whispered, tugging gently on Martha's apron. "Why does she look so sad?" Martha glanced down at her son, then back at the stranger who was now allowing Doc Slattery to examine her injuries. "Sometimes people carry hurts that go deeper than what you can see on the outside, Ethan," she said quietly. "Sometimes the worst wounds are the ones that don't bleed." She had recognized something in Shenoa's expression that she had seen in her own mirror during the dark months after losing her first husband to cholera, the look of someone who had lost more than they knew how to bear. Doc Slattery's examination revealed the full extent of Shenoa's injuries. In addition to the dislocated shoulder and the gash on her thigh, he found evidence of older wounds that had healed badly, scars that told the story of a life lived in constant conflict. "This shoulder needs to be reset immediately," he announced to the group. "The longer we wait, the more damage there'll be to the joint. And that leg wound needs cleaning and stitching, or it's going to get infected and kill her just as sure as a bullet." He looked directly at Big Jim. "I can't do proper work on her out here in the dirt." Various Pete stepped forward aggressively. "You're not seriously thinking about bringing her inside, are you, Doc? This is exactly the kind of soft-headed thinking that gets settlements burned out and families scalped in their beds. She's Indian, for God's sake, the enemy." His voice had risen to the point where other residents of Henderson stock began to emerge from their buildings, drawn by the commotion and the possibility of conflict. Sarah McKinney appeared from the boarding house, her twin daughters hanging back in the doorway behind her. She took in the scene quickly, the wounded Indian woman, the men with their weapons, the tension that hung in the air like smoke. "What's happening here?" she asked, directing her question to Martha Henderson, rather than to any of the men. Women on the frontier had learned to communicate with each other in ways that cut through masculine posturing and got to the heart of practical matters. "Wounded traveler," Martha replied simply. "Doc says she needs medical attention." The two women exchanged a look that conveyed volumes about the realities of frontier life, where the difference between survival and death often came down to simple human decency in the face of prejudice and fear. Sarah McKinney had nursed her own husband through his final illness without any help from doctors, and she understood better than most men that suffering was suffering, regardless of the color of the person experiencing it. "Bring her to my place," Sarah said suddenly, surprising everyone including herself. "I've got a clean room with good light, and I can boil water while Doc works on her. My girls can stay in the kitchen where they won't be in the way." She ignored the sharp look that various Pete shot in her direction, focusing instead on the Covey practical necessities of the situation. If she's going to die, at least let her die clean and comfortable. Big Jim found himself caught between conflicting impulses, his duty to protect his community, his respect for his wife's judgment, and his own complicated feelings about Indians in general. He had fought against Confederate forces during the Civil War, not against Native Americans, and his hatred was reserved for rebels and traitors, rather than for people who were simply defending their land and way of life. But he also knew that emotions in the settlement ran high when it came to Indians, especially in the wake of Little Bighorn. "If we do this," he said finally, "we do it right. She gives up that rifle, and someone stays with her at all times. Doc can treat her, but she doesn't move around the settlement freely, and she leaves as soon as she's able to travel. I won't have it said that Henderson Stop harbors Indian raiders." His words were directed at Chenoa, but his eyes swept the gathered crowd, making sure that everyone understood the conditions he was setting. Chenoa struggled to her feet, swaying slightly as the movement sent fresh spikes of pain through her injuries. She reached behind her back and carefully lifted the rifle from its carrying position, holding it by the barrel with her good hand. "This belonged to my brother," she said, her voice carrying a weight of loss that made even various Pete shift uncomfortably. "He died 4 days ago, along with 14 other warriors of our band. I am the only one left." She extended the weapon toward Big Jim, offering it butt first in a gesture of surrender. The rifle was a Henry repeating rifle, a weapon that commanded respect among frontiersmen for its reliability and firepower. Big Jim accepted it carefully, noting the intricate beadwork on the leather sling and the small medicine bundle tied to the stock with sinew. These personal touches transformed the weapon from a simple tool of war into something more intimate, a connection to the dead man who had carried it, and the woman who now honored his memory by surrendering it. Doc Slattery moved to Chenoa's side, offering his arm for support. "Can you walk that far?" he asked, indicating Sarah McKinney's boarding house 50 yards away. "Or do we need to fashion some kind of stretcher?" His concern was purely medical now, the question of her identity and allegiance temporarily set aside in favor of more immediate needs. A doctor's oath was colorblind, and despite his personal failings, he had never forgotten that fundamental truth. "I can walk," Chenoa replied, though the tremor in her voice suggested that each step would cost her dearly. She had walked for 4 days across open prairie with these injuries. Surely she could manage 50 more yards to reach shelter and medical care. But as she took her first step toward the boarding house, her wounded leg buckled and she began to fall. Ethan Burke darted forward before anyone could stop him, his small body sliding under Chenoa's good arm to provide support. For a moment, the wounded woman leaned heavily on the boy, and he could feel the fever heat radiating from her skin, could smell the scent of blood and exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. "I got you," he said simply, his boy's voice steady. Despite the adult responsibility he had suddenly taken on himself, the sight of the small white boy supporting the wounded Indian woman created a tableau that struck everyone, present in different ways. Various Pete saw it as evidence of dangerous naivety that would get them all killed. Martha Henderson saw it as proof of her son's good heart and natural compassion. Sarah McKinney saw it as a reminder that children often possessed wisdom that adults had forgotten. And Chenoa White Dove saw it as something she had never expected to find among her enemies, simple human kindness offered without conditions or expectations. Together, the unlikely pair made their slow way toward the boarding house, followed by Doc Slattery with his medical bag and Sarah McKinney with her practical concern for cleanliness and proper nursing care. Behind them, the men of Henderson Stop stood watching, each lost in his own thoughts about what they had just witnessed and what it might mean for their small community. As they reached the steps of the boarding house, Chenoa paused and looked back at Big Jim Henderson, who still held her brother's rifle in his massive hands. "Thank you," she said simply, the two words carrying more weight than a lengthy speech. "I will not forget this kindness." Then she allowed Ethan and Doc Slattery to help her up the steps and into the building, disappearing from view but leaving behind questions that would not be easily answered. The morning sun had climbed higher during the confrontation, and now it beat down on the settlement with the merciless intensity that promised another scorching day. But inside Sarah McKinney's boarding house, in a small clean room with white curtains and a comfortable bed, Chenoa White Dove was about to discover that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources, and that the line between enemy and friend was often thinner than the edge of a knife. Inside Sarah McKinney's boarding house, the clean room with its white curtains and simple wooden furniture felt like a palace to Chenoa after 4 days of sleeping on the hard ground. Doc Slattery had set up his instruments on a small table near the window, where the morning light would give him the best visibility for his work. Sarah bustled around efficiently, boiling water on the small stove and laying out clean towels and bandages with the practiced ease of a woman who had tended to more injuries than she cared to remember. "This is going to hurt considerably," Doc Slattery warned as he prepared to reset Chenoa's dislocated shoulder. "I can give you some laudanum for the pain, but it might make you drowsy, and I suspect you'd prefer to stay alert." His hands moved over her shoulder joint with professional gentleness, feeling for the exact position of the displaced bone and calculating the force and angle needed to put it back in place. Chenoa shook her head at the offer of laudanum. She had seen what the white man's medicine could do to warriors who became dependent on it, had watched proud fighters reduced to begging shadows of themselves in the trading posts near the reservations. "I will endure the pain," she said simply. "My people have rituals for such things." She reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew a piece of leather, placing it between her teeth to bite down on. Young Ethan had positioned himself in the corner of the room where he could watch without getting in the way, his blue eyes wide with fascination and concern. He had never seen a doctor work before, and despite his mother's worried glances, he seemed determined to witness whatever was about to happen. There was something about the wounded woman that had captured his imagination completely, though he couldn't have explained why if asked. Doc Slattery took a firm grip on Chenoa's arm and shoulder. "On the count of 3, he said. 1, 2. On 2 instead of 3, he gave a sharp, controlled twist that snapped the joint back into place with an audible pop. Chenoa's body went rigid and her teeth bit deep into the leather, but she made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath through her nose. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her eyes remained focused and alert. "Good," Doc Slattery said with professional satisfaction. "The joint went back cleanly. You'll need to keep that arm immobilized for at least a week, maybe 2, to let the ligaments heal properly." He began fashioning a sling from a clean sheet, his movements quick and efficient. "Now let's have a look at that leg wound. It's going to need cleaning and stitching, and from the smell, there's already some infection starting." Sarah McKinney had been studying Chenoa's face during the shoulder treatment, noting the way the woman controlled her pain through sheer force of will rather than any kind of medication. It reminded her of her own struggles during childbirth. When women learn to endure agony because there was simply no alternative. "You're tougher than most men I've known," she said with grudging admiration. "Including my late husband, and he fought through the entire war without so much as a whimper." As Doc Slattery began cleaning the infected wound on Chenoa's thigh, she found herself studying the faces of the white people who were helping her. It was difficult to reconcile their kindness with everything she had been taught about the settlers who were taking her people's land. She had expected cruelty, hatred, perhaps a quick death if she was lucky. Instead, she found herself being treated with a consideration that many of her own people would not have shown to a wounded enemy. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly, the question directed at no one in particular but hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Your people and mine are at war. I have killed white soldiers, burned white settlements, taken white scalps. You know this, yet you treat my wounds and give me shelter. I do not understand." Her voice carried genuine puzzlement, as if she were confronting a mystery that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. Sarah McKinney paused in her work, considering the question carefully. "Because you're hurt," she said. Finally, as if that simple fact explained everything. "Because you're alone and far from home. Because my children are watching, and I want them to learn that mercy is stronger than hatred." She resumed folding bandages, her movements brisk and practical. "And maybe because I've lost enough to this war already, without adding more death to the tally." Doc Slattery looked up from his stitching work, his needle pausing in mid-motion. "I took an oath when I became a doctor," he said quietly. "First, do no harm." It doesn't say anything about the color of a patient's skin or which side of a war they're fighting on. Pain is pain, and death is death, regardless of who's experiencing it. He resumed his careful work, each stitch placed with the precision of long practice. Young Ethan spoke up from his corner, his boy's voice clear and direct in the way that only children could manage. "My pa says Indians are bad people who want to hurt us," he said, causing all the adults in the room to tense slightly. "But you don't look bad. You look sad, like my ma does sometimes when she thinks about my real pa." His words hung in the air with the uncomfortable weight of innocent truth. Martha Henderson chose that moment to enter the room, carrying a tray with hot soup and fresh bread. She had heard her son's words, and her face flushed slightly with embarrassment at his directness. "Ethan Burke Henderson," she said firmly. "That's no way to talk to a guest in Mrs. McKinney's house." But even as she scolded her son, her eyes met Chenoa's with a look of understanding that transcended the barriers of race and culture. Chenoa studied the boy's open face, seeing none of the hatred or fear that she had expected to find in the eyes of white children. "Your son speaks truth," she said to Martha. "I am sad. I have lost many people I loved, and I carry the weight of their deaths with me wherever I go." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "But he is also right that I have done bad things. I have brought death to families like yours, taken fathers from children like him." The admission fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of tension and uncertainty. Various Pete, who had been lurking outside the boarding house, chose that moment to push through the door uninvited, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "I knew it," he declared triumphantly. "I told you all she was dangerous. Now she's confessing to murder right here in front of the boy. We should have shot her where she stood instead of playing nursemaid to a killer." Doc Slattery finished his last stitch and tied off the thread before turning to face the intruder. "Pete, you're drunk and you're out of line," he said calmly. "This woman is under medical care, which makes her my responsibility. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me outside after I'm finished here." Despite his reputation for drinking, the doctor's voice carried an authority that made even various Pete hesitate. But Pete was too far gone in drink and righteousness to back down easily. "Medical care, hell," he snarled. She just admitted to killing white folks, and you're sitting there sewing her up like she was your own mother. What's next, Doc? You going to invite her to Sunday dinner and ask her to tell stories about all the settlements she's burned? His hand dropped to his pistol grip, though he didn't draw the weapon. Sarah McKinney moved protectively between Pete and the bed where Chenoa lay recovering from her treatment. You'll not threaten anyone in my house, Pete Wilson, she said. Firmly, her voice carrying the steel that frontier women learned to forge from necessity. Drunk or sober, injured or healthy, guest or enemy, doesn't matter. My house, my rules. And my rule is that nobody gets hurt under my roof without answering to me personally. Chenoa struggled to sit up straighter, despite the pain from her freshly treated wounds. She could see that her presence was creating divisions among these people, threatening the peace of their small community. I will leave, she said quietly. I do not wish to bring conflict to those who have shown me kindness. Give me my brother's rifle, and I will go into the wilderness. You will not see me again. Her offer was made with dignity, but everyone in the room could see that she was in no condition to survive alone on the prairie. Young Ethan stepped forward suddenly, his small face set with determination that reminded everyone present of his mother's stubborn streak. No, he said firmly, surprising the adults with the force of his conviction. She's hurt, and hurt people don't get sent away. That's not how we do things. He looked directly at Various Pete, showing no fear of the armed and angry man. My May says mercy is stronger than hatred. That means we help people even when it's hard. Martha Henderson felt her heart swell with pride at her son's courage, even as she worried about the dangerous situation he was inserting himself into. Ethan's right, she said, moving to stand beside Sarah McKinney in a show of solidarity. We don't turn away people who need help, regardless of what they might have done in the past. That's not who we are, and it's not who we're going to become. Her words were directed at Pete, but they carried enough volume to be heard by the crowd that had gathered outside the boarding house. Various Pete looked around the room, realizing that he was outnumbered not just in numbers, but in moral authority. The women had taken their stand, the doctor had made his position clear, and even the boy was defying him. But he was too proud and too drunk to back down gracefully. Fine, he said bitterly. Coddle your pet Indian if you want. But when she cuts your throats in the night, don't come crying to me, Dot, and when her warrior friends come looking for her, don't expect me to stand with you against them. With that parting shot, he stumbled out of the room, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. Doc Slattery resumed packing his medical instruments, his movements deliberate and unhurried. That man's been carrying poison in his heart for too long, he observed quietly. It's eating him alive from the inside, and he wants to share the infection with the rest of us. He closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. The shoulders set properly, and the leg wound is clean and stitched. Keep her quiet for a few days, and she should heal up fine. Sarah McKinney began gathering up the bloody bandages and used instruments. She can stay here as long as she needs to, she declared firmly. I've got an empty room, and Lord knows I've seen worse things than a wounded Indian woman. She paused in her cleaning, looking directly at Chenoa. But I'll ask you the same thing I'd ask any guest in my house. No weapons, no threats. No trouble for my other boarders. Can you agree to those terms? Chenoa nodded slowly, understanding that she was being offered something precious and fragile. A chance to heal not just her body, but perhaps something deeper. I give you my word, she said formally. While I am under your roof, I will bring no harm to you or yours. This I swear by the memory of my brother and the spirits of my ancestors. The words carried the weight of a sacred oath, spoken with the gravity that such promises demanded. As the adults continued their conversation, young Ethan found himself studying Chenoa with the intense curiosity that only children possessed. What was your brother like? He asked suddenly, causing the adults to pause in their discussion. The one whose rifle you gave to my pa, was he nice? The question was asked with the innocent directness that made adults uncomfortable, because it cut straight to the heart of complex matters. Chenoa's eyes softened as she thought of many horses, remembering not the warrior who had died in the ambush but the boy who had taught her to shoot a bow, who had shared his food with stray dogs, who had sung lullabies to sick children in their village. "He was kind," she said quietly. "He laughed often, and he never turned away anyone who needed help. He would have liked you, I think. You have his spirit of generosity." The admission surprised her with its honesty. Martha Henderson recognized the expression on Chenoa's face, the particular blend of love and loss that mothers wore when speaking of children who were gone. "How old was he?" she asked gently, her own maternal instincts responding to the pain she saw in the other woman's eyes. It was a question that had nothing to do with warfare or politics, and everything to do with the universal experience of grief. 22 winters, Chenoa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was my baby brother, though he grew to be taller and stronger than our father. I was supposed to protect him, to keep him safe with my scouting skills. Instead, I led him and 14 other warriors into an ambush that killed them all." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly might somehow lessen their weight. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with guilt and sorrow. Sarah McKinney recognized the particular agony of survivors. Guilt, having experienced it herself when her husband died of fever while she remained healthy. "Guilt is a heavy burden to carry," she said softly, "especially when it's not really yours to bear. Bad things happen in war, and good people die, and it's not always someone's fault. Sometimes it's just the cruel randomness of a cruel world." Doc Slattery had finished packing his instruments, but he lingered in the room, drawn by the raw emotion of the conversation. "I've seen a lot of men broken by survivors' guilt," he said quietly. "Soldiers who lived through battles that killed their friends, doctors who couldn't save patients they cared about. The guilt can eat you alive if you let it, but it can also drive you to do better, to honor the memory of those you've lost by helping others." His words carried the weight of personal experience. Young Ethan, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention that children gave to matters they sensed were important, suddenly spoke up again. "Maybe that's why you came here," he said to Chenoa. "Maybe your brother's spirit guided you to people who would help you so you could get better and help other people. My grandma always said that good people find each other when they need to most." His words, spoken with the simple faith of childhood, seemed to illuminate something that the adults had missed. Chenoa stared at the boy, struck by the unexpected wisdom in his innocent observation. In her own culture, signs and spiritual guidance were taken seriously, and the idea that her brother's spirit might have led her to safety was not as far-fetched as it might seem to white sensibilities. "Perhaps you are right, young warrior," she said, using the term of respect that Lakota adults used for children who showed courage and wisdom. "Perhaps there are purposes we cannot see from where we stand." As the afternoon light began to slant through the windows of the boarding house, the small group in the room found themselves bound together by something deeper than circumstance. They had moved beyond the simple transaction of medical care into something more complex and meaningful, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the boundaries of race and culture and history. But outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and not all of them were made of weather. 3 days had passed since Chenoa's arrival at Henderson's stop, and the uneasy peace that had settled over the settlement was about to be shattered in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The wounded Sioux woman had spent most of her time resting in Sarah McKinney's boarding house, her strength slowly returning under the careful ministrations of Doc Slattery and the surprisingly tender care of young Ethan, who had appointed himself her unofficial guardian and had taken to bringing her meals and reading to her from his mother's collection of books. On this particular morning, as the sun climbed through a sky streaked with thin clouds that promised no relief from the late autumn heat, A dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon that would change everything. Big Jim Henderson was the first to spot it from his position on the trading post porch, where he had been keeping watch with the methodical vigilance of a man who understood that survival on the frontier depended on seeing trouble before it saw. The approaching riders numbered at least 15, moving in the disciplined formation that marked them as either cavalry or experienced Indian fighters. Big Jim called out to Various Pete, who had been sulking around the settlement for the past 3 days like a man nursing a grudge and waiting for an opportunity to prove himself right. "Pete, get up here and tell me what you make of those riders," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who expected to be obeyed without question. Various Pete scrambled up onto the porch roof with the agility of a man half his age, his eyes squinting against the morning glare as he studied the approaching dust cloud. After several minutes of careful observation, he climbed back down with an expression of grim satisfaction that made Big Jim's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Military," Pete announced with the certainty of a man who had spent years reading the signs of mounted formations. "But not regular cavalry. These boys are riding too tight and too fast for a routine patrol." Inside the boarding house, Sioux had been awakened by the commotion outside and had managed to make her way to the window, despite the protests of her healing injuries. One look at the approaching riders was enough to send ice through her veins, for she recognized the formation and riding style of a specific type of military unit, one that specialized in tracking down and eliminating Indian war parties. These were not ordinary soldiers conducting a routine sweep of the territory. These were hunters, and they were following a trail that led directly to Henderson's stop. She turned from the window to find young Ethan standing in the doorway, his face pale with worry as he took in her expression of barely controlled fear. "What's wrong?" he asked with the directness that had become characteristic of their conversations. "Are those soldiers coming for you?" His question cut straight to the heart of the matter with the uncomfortable accuracy that children often possessed when dealing with adult deceptions. Chenoweth nodded slowly, knowing that there was no point in lying to the boy who had shown her such kindness. "Yes," she said quietly. "They are hunting me. They followed the trail I left when I came here, and now they will demand that your people turn me over to them." She moved away from the window, her mind racing as she considered her limited options. "I must leave immediately, before they arrive. I will not allow harm to come to those who have helped me." But even as she spoke these words, Chenoweth knew that her departure would accomplish nothing except to delay the inevitable confrontation. The soldiers had already seen the settlement, had already marked it as the place where her trail ended. If she fled now, they would assume that the residents had helped her escape, and their anger would fall upon the innocent people who had shown her mercy. The trap had been sprung not when she arrived, but when she had allowed herself to hope that she might find safety among her enemies. Young Ethan, with the stubborn determination that he had inherited from both his parents, stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "You can't leave," he said with absolute conviction. "You're still hurt, and besides, running away won't solve anything. Those soldiers will just hurt everyone here trying to find out where you went." His analysis of the situation was delivered with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone too young to be intimidated by the complexity of adult problems. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats had grown loud enough to be heard clearly throughout the settlement. Sarah McKinney appeared in the doorway, her face set with the grim determination of a woman who had already lost one husband to violence and was not prepared to lose her home to military brutality. "They're here," she announced simply. 15 men, all armed, led by a captain who looks like he's been eating nails for breakfast. And they're asking questions about Indian sign around the settlement. The 3 of them stood frozen for a moment, each understanding that the next few minutes would determine not only Chenoweth's fate, but the future of everyone at Henderson's stop. The soldiers outside represented the full weight of military authority, backed by government policy, while the wounded woman in the boarding house represented nothing more than a promise, made by decent people to help someone in need. It should have been an easy choice, but sometimes the right decision was also the most dangerous one. Captain Marcus Thornfield dismounted from his black stallion with the fluid grace of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. His uniform bore the dust and stains of hard travel, but his bearing remained crisp and military despite the obvious fatigue of his men and horses. He was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and eyes the color of winter sky, and he carried himself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question or delay. Big Jim Henderson emerged from the trading post to meet the captain, his massive frame imposing even next to the mounted soldiers, who remained in formation behind their leader. "Captain," he said with cautious politeness, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that acknowledged military rank without quite constituting a salute. "Welcome to Henderson's Stop. What brings the cavalry to our little settlement?" His tone was neutral, giving away nothing while seeking information. Captain Thornfield studied Big Jim with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. "We're tracking a Sioux war party that raided a cavalry supply train 6 days ago," he said without preamble. 15 warriors dead in the engagement, but we have reason to believe that at least one survivor escaped and may have sought shelter in this area. "Have you seen any sign of Indian activity in the past few days?" His question was delivered with the casual efficiency of someone who expected a prompt and honest answer. Various Pete stepped forward eagerly, his earlier predictions about harboring dangerous Indians suddenly seeming prophetic rather than paranoid. "Captain, sir," he began, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had been waiting for this moment of vindication. "We've got exactly what you're looking for right here in the settlement. Wounded Sioux woman arrived 3 days ago with a rifle and a pack full of lies about being alone and peaceful. She's holed up in McKinney's boarding house right now, being nursed back to health like some kind of honored guest." The captain's eyes sharpened with interest, and he gestured for 2 of his men to dismount and prepare to accompany him. "Show me," he commanded simply, his tone carrying the finality of a man who had found what he was looking for and intended to claim it regardless of any complications that might arise. "And I'll want to speak with whoever's been harboring her. Aiding enemy combatants is a serious offense under military law." Big Jim felt the situation slipping out of his control as the captain and his men prepared to enter the boarding house. "Now hold on just a minute, Captain," he said, his voice carrying a note of warning. The woman was wounded and seeking medical attention. Doc Slattery treated her injuries, and Mrs. McKinney provided shelter. That's not harboring an enemy, that's basic human decency. We don't turn away hurt people, regardless of their politics or the color of their skin. Captain Thornfield paused in his advance toward the boarding house, turning to fix Big Jim with a stare that could have frozen water in July. "Mr. Henderson," he said with deadly quiet, "that woman is responsible for the deaths of 7 cavalry soldiers and the theft of military supplies worth more than this entire settlement. She is not some lost traveler seeking help. She is a war criminal who needs to face military justice. Anyone who has aided her will be held accountable under the Articles of War." Inside the boarding house, Chenoa could hear the voices growing louder and more heated as the confrontation escalated. She knew that her continued presence was putting everyone who had helped her in mortal danger, but she also knew that surrendering herself to Captain Thornfield would accomplish nothing except to satisfy his need for revenge. She had heard enough stories from survivors of other encounters with military justice to know that her trial would be brief and her execution swift. Young Ethan had been listening at the window, his young face growing paler as he absorbed the implications of what he was hearing. "They want to hurt you," he said simply, turning to face Chenoa with eyes that seemed older than his 8 years. and they want to hurt everyone who helped you too. That's not fair. You didn't ask us to help you, we chose to do it because it was the right thing." His sense of justice was offended by the captain's threats against his family and neighbors Sarah. McKinney entered the room carrying a shotgun that she held with the comfortable familiarity of a woman who had learned to defend herself and her property without relying on others for protection. "There's a back door that leads to the stable," she said quietly. "If you can make it that far, there's a horse saddled and ready. It's not much of a head start, but it's better than nothing. These soldiers have been riding hard, and their mounts are tired." But Chenoa shook her head, understanding something that the others had not yet grasped. "Running will only make things worse for all of you," she said with quiet certainty. "The captain will assume that you helped me escape, and he will punish everyone in the settlement. I have brought enough death to innocent people. I will not add your names to that list." She moved toward the door with the slow determination of someone who had made a decision that could not be unmade. Ethan stepped in front of her, his small body blocking her path with surprising effectiveness. "No," he said with the absolute conviction that only children could muster when confronting adult foolishness. "There has to be another way. My payan always says that there's more than one solution to every problem if you're smart enough to find it." His faith in the possibility of a peaceful resolution was touching in its innocence and heartbreaking in its futility. The sound of heavy boots on the boarding house porch announced that the confrontation was about to move indoors, where the close quarters would make violence almost inevitable. Captain Thornfield's voice carried clearly through the thin walls as he questioned Sarah McKinney about her guests and their recent activities. "Ma'am," he was saying with exaggerated politeness, "I'm going to need to search your establishment for the Indian woman we're tracking. You can make this easy by cooperating, or you can make it hard by interfering with a military operation." Sarah's response was delivered in a voice that carried the steel of a woman who had buried one husband and was not intimidated by threats from another man in uniform. "Captain, this is a private residence and a business establishment. You'll need more than suspicion and military authority to search my property without permission. Show me a warrant signed by a civilian judge, or remove yourself and your men from my porch." Her defiance surprised even herself, but the presence of young Ethan in danger had awakened something fierce and protective in her nature. The sound of a rifle being cocked echoed through the morning air, followed by Captain Thornfield's voice, now stripped of all pretense of politeness. "Ma'am, I'm ordering you to stand aside and allow my men to search this building. Resistance to lawful military authority is a federal offense punishable by imprisonment or worse. This is your final warning." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired in the back room. Chenoa closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to the spirits of her ancestors, asking for the strength to do what needed to be done and the wisdom to minimize the harm that would flow from her choices. When she opened her eyes again, young Ethan was staring at her with a mixture of fear and determination that reminded her powerfully of her dead brother in his final moments. "Whatever happens," she told the boy quietly, "remember that courage is not the absence of fear, it is doing what is right despite being afraid." The door to the boarding house burst open with a crash that seemed to shake the entire building, and Captain Thornfield strode inside followed by 4 armed soldiers. His eyes swept the main room with practiced efficiency before settling on Sarah McKinney, who stood blocking the hallway that led to the back rooms. "Last chance, ma'am," he said with deadly calm. "Step aside or be moved aside. The choice is yours, but the outcome is not." At that moment, Chenoa White Dove made a decision that would transform her from a hunted fugitive into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. She stepped into the hallway, her healing injuries forgotten in the surge of adrenaline that flooded her system, and called out in a voice that carried the authority of a war chief addressing his warriors. "I am here, Captain. I am the one you seek. But if you want me, you will have to come through. These people who have shown me kindness when they owed me nothing but bullets." The confrontation that followed would be remembered at Henderson's stop for generations to come, not for its violence, but for the unexpected alliances it forged and the heroism it revealed in the most unlikely places. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought between armies on distant battlefields, but between neighbors in boarding house hallways, where the stakes are measured not in territory gained or lost, but in the preservation of simple human decency. In a world that had forgotten the meaning of mercy, the silence that followed Chenoa's declaration stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Each person in the boarding house calculating odds and consequences while the weight of history pressed down upon them all. Captain Thornfield studied the wounded Sioux woman with the cold assessment of a predator sizing up prey. But what he saw was not the broken fugitive he had expected to find. Instead, he faced a warrior who had chosen her ground and was prepared to make her final stand in the most unlikely of places. Young Ethan Burke, with the fearless instinct that sometimes possessed children in moments of crisis, stepped forward to stand beside Chenoa despite his mother's sharp intake of breath from the front room. "She's our guest," he announced with the absolute conviction of innocence confronting injustice. "And guests don't get hurt in our house. That's the rule." His small hand found Chenoa's larger one, and the gesture of solidarity between the white boy and the Indian woman created a tableau that stopped even the hardened soldiers in their tracks. Captain Thornfield's jaw tightened as he realized that the situation had become far more complicated than a simple arrest of a fugitive war criminal. The presence of the child changed everything, transforming what should have been a straightforward military operation into a potential massacre of civilians that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Son," he said carefully, his voice losing some of its harsh edge, "you don't understand what's happening here. This woman is dangerous. She's killed American soldiers, and she needs to face justice for her crimes." But Ethan's response cut through the captain's reasoning with the devastating logic of childhood. "She's hurt, and she's scared, and she's sad about her brother who got killed," the boy said simply. "That doesn't sound dangerous to me. That sounds like she needs help, not more hurting." His words hung in the air with uncomfortable truth, forcing everyone present to confront the human reality behind the military abstractions of enemy combatants and war criminals. Doc Slattery appeared in the hallway behind the soldiers, his medical bag in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other, though whether the latter was for medicinal purposes or personal fortification remained unclear. "Captain," he said with the authoritative voice of a man who had held the same rank during the Civil War, "as the attending physician, I'm ordering you not to move this patient. She's suffered severe trauma to her shoulder joint and a deep laceration. That's just beginning to heal properly. Transportation in her current condition could result in permanent disability or death." The captain turned to face this new challenge to his authority, his eyes narrowing as he took in Doc Slattery's disheveled appearance and the unmistakable scent of alcohol that surrounded him like a cloud. "Doctor," he said with barely concealed contempt, "your medical opinion is noted and disregarded. This woman is a prisoner of war, not a patient, and should be transported according to military necessity rather than medical convenience." His dismissal was delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had learned to dehumanize his enemies. But Doc Slattery had not survived the carnage of Antietam and Gettysburg, only to be intimidated by a frontier cavalry officer with delusions of grandeur. "Then you'll be transporting the corpse, Captain," he said flatly, "because I'll personally ensure that any attempt to move her results in immediate medical complications that even a military tribunal will have difficulty explaining away." The threat was delivered with the matter-of-fact precision of a man who understood exactly how to make good on his promises. Sarah McKinney stepped forward, positioning herself between the soldiers and the hallway that led to the back rooms where her twin daughters were hiding. "Gentlemen," she said with the deceptive calm of a woman who had learned to negotiate from a position of apparent weakness. Perhaps we can find a solution that serves everyone's interests. Captain Thornfield wants his prisoner, and we want to ensure that justice is done properly. Surely there's middle ground that doesn't require threats or violence. Captain Thornfield studied the faces arrayed against him, recognizing something that his military training had not prepared him to handle. Civilians who were willing to risk everything to protect someone they had no obligation to defend. It was the kind of moral courage that made military operations messy and complicated, transforming simple objectives into ethical quandaries that could derail careers and haunt consciences. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. McKinney?" he asked warily before Sarah could respond. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of new players in the unfolding drama. Big Jim Henderson's voice carried clearly from the front porch as he called out a warning that made everyone in the boarding house tense with apprehension. "Captain, you've got more company coming. Looks like Indian riders, maybe 8 or 10 of them, approaching from the north. They're flying a white flag, but they're armed and they look like they mean business." Chenoa's eyes widened with recognition, and something that might have been hope as she heard the description of the approaching riders. "Lakota Red Wolf," she whispered, speaking a name that carried the weight of family and obligation. "My cousin, he has come looking for me." Her voice carried a mixture of relief and worry, for while Dakota's arrival might mean rescue, it also meant that the already dangerous situation was about to become exponentially more volatile. Captain Thornfield cursed under his breath as he realized that his simple arrest operation had just become a potential diplomatic incident that could escalate into open warfare. "How many men does your cousin typically ride with?" he demanded of Chenoa, his military mind already calculating odds and tactical disadvantages. The answer would determine whether he was facing a rescue party or a war band, and the distinction would shape his response. "He leads 20 warriors," Chenoa replied honestly, understanding that deception at this point would only make things worse for everyone involved. "But he will have brought only his best fighters if he came looking for me. These are men who have ridden with him since childhood, and they will not abandon one of their own to white justice." Her words carried the certainty of someone who understood the bonds that held war parties together. Young Ethan tugged on Chenoa's hand, his eyes bright with the excitement of a child who saw adventure where adults saw catastrophe. "Maybe your cousin can help us figure this out," he suggested with the optimism that only childhood could sustain in the face of overwhelming complexity. "My pa always says that most problems can be solved if people just talk to each other instead of shooting first and asking questions later." The approaching Indian riders had closed to within 100 yards of the settlement, and through the windows everyone could see that they had indeed stopped and were displaying a white flag of truce. But they had also positioned themselves in a formation that would allow them to attack or retreat with equal effectiveness, and their horses pranced nervously as if sensing the tension that crackled through the morning air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Captain Thornfield found himself caught between competing obligations and impossible choices. His orders were clear: capture or kill the surviving member of the war party that had attacked the cavalry supply train. But those orders had not anticipated the complication of civilian resistance, medical concerns, or the arrival of additional Indian forces that could turn a simple arrest into a full-scale battle that would leave innocent people dead. Doc Slattery moved closer to the captain, lowering his voice so that only the military man could hear his words. "Captain, I served under Grant at Vicksburg, and I learned something about the difference between winning battles and winning wars. Sometimes the smart move is to step back and look for solutions that don't require counting bodies afterward. You've got civilians in the line of fire and enemy forces arriving with unknown intentions. Maybe it's time to consider alternatives to a purely military solution." The wisdom in the doctor's words was undeniable, but Captain Thornfield's pride and his understanding of military Discipline made it difficult for him to back down from a confrontation he had initiated. "Doctor," he said quietly, "if I allow a known enemy combatant to escape justice because of civilian interference, I'll face a court-martial that will end my career and possibly result in imprisonment. The military doesn't reward officers who choose compassion over duty." But before Doc Slattery could respond, the situation took another unexpected turn as Martha Henderson entered the boarding house accompanied by a tall Indian man, whose presence seemed to fill the entire room despite the crowded conditions. Dakota Red Wolf was perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of a man who had spent his life in the saddle and the calm bearing of someone accustomed to leadership and responsibility. His clothing was a mixture of traditional buckskin and practical white man's gear, and he carried himself with quiet dignity despite the obvious tension of the situation. "Cousin," he said simply, addressing Chenoa in the Lakota language before switching to English for the benefit of the others present. "I have been tracking you for 3 days. The spirits whispered that you lived when others thought you had joined many horses in the land beyond the stars." His eyes swept the room, taking in the armed soldiers, the protective civilians, and the wounded woman who was the center of all the conflict. Captain Thornfield stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm but not drawing it. "I am Captain Marcus Thornfield, United States Army," he announced formally. "This woman is wanted for crimes against American forces, and she will be taken into custody according to military law. Your presence here changes nothing except to add charges of interfering with a lawful arrest." His words were delivered with official authority, but everyone in the room could hear the uncertainty beneath the formal language. Dakota Red Wolf studied the captain with the measuring gaze of a man who had negotiated with white officials before and understood the delicate balance of power and face-saving that such encounters required. "Captain," he said with careful respect, "my cousin is a woman of honor who has never violated the laws of war as her people understand them. If she has caused harm to your soldiers, it was in defense of her own people and her own land. Perhaps there is a way to resolve this matter that satisfies both justice and mercy." Young Ethan, who had been following the conversation with the intense focus that children brought to adult drama, suddenly spoke up with an idea that surprised everyone. With its simple brilliance, "Why don't we have a trial right here?" he suggested. "Like in the stories my ma reads me about King Arthur and his knights. Everyone gets to tell their side, and then we decide what's fair based on what really happened instead of just who's got the most guns." The suggestion fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of possibility that none of the adults had considered. Sarah McKinney was the first to seize upon the idea, recognizing its potential to diffuse a situation that was rapidly spiraling toward violence. "The boy's right," she said firmly. "We could convene a citizens' court with representatives from both sides. Captain Thornfield could present his evidence, and Chenoa could tell her story. Let the facts determine justice instead of military expediency." Captain Thornfield's first instinct was to reject the proposal as absurd. Military justice was not subject to civilian interference, and certainly not to the whims of frontier settlers who had no understanding of military law or the larger strategic implications of the conflict. But as he looked around the room at the determined faces arrayed against him, he began to realize that his alternatives were limited and none of them were particularly attractive. Doc Slattery stepped forward with the authority of a man who had seen enough of war to understand its true costs. "Captain, you came here with 15 men to arrest one wounded woman. Now you're facing armed Indian warriors, hostile civilians, and a situation that could escalate into exactly the kind of massacre that ends military careers and creates diplomatic incidents. Maybe the boy's idea isn't as crazy as it sounds. Maybe it's the smartest thing anyone said all morning." Dakota Red Wolf nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in seeking a peaceful resolution that would allow all parties to maintain their honor while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. "My warriors and I will agree to such a trial," he announced formally, "provided that it is conducted with fairness and that all voices are heard. We seek justice, not vengeance, and we are willing to accept judgment that is based on truth rather than prejudice." His words carried the weight of a chief speaking for his people. Martha Henderson, who had been watching the proceedings with the calculating eye of a woman who understood the importance of practical details, stepped forward with her own contribution to the emerging solution. "We'll need neutral judges," she said practically. "People who aren't involved in the military conflict, but who understand frontier law and Indian customs. I propose that we ask Reverend Morrison from Fort Laramie to serve, along with Chief White Bear from the reservation. They're both respected men who've dealt with disputes between whites and Indians before." The proposal gained momentum as more details were worked out, with each party contributing conditions and safeguards that would ensure a fair hearing for all concerned. Captain Thornfield reluctantly agreed to delay his arrest pending the outcome of the civilian trial, while Dakota Red Wolf promised that his warriors would camp peacefully outside the settlement and would not interfere with the proceedings unless treachery was attempted. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation as word spread across the territory about the unprecedented trial that would take place at Henderson's Stop. Reverend Morrison arrived from Fort Laramie on the second day, a man of perhaps 50 years with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough of frontier life to understand the complexities of justice in a land where law and order were still being written in blood and compromise. His weathered hands spoke of years spent building churches and mediating disputes, while his calm demeanor suggested a man who had learned to find wisdom in the spaces between absolute positions. Chief White Bear came from the reservation with 2 elder warriors who would serve as witnesses and advisors, their presence lending gravity and authenticity to the proceedings. The chief was a man of advanced years whose face bore the intricate tattoos that marked him as a keeper of tribal law and custom, and his eyes held the deep patience of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of many conflicts. His arrival was accompanied by traditional ceremonies that blessed the ground where the trial would take place, acknowledging the sacred nature of justice and the responsibility of those who would dispense it. The trading post had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom, with tables arranged to accommodate the judges, the accused, and the various parties who would present evidence. Martha Henderson had worked tirelessly to ensure that the space was prepared properly, understanding that the appearance of fairness was almost as important as fairness itself in a situation where every gesture would be scrutinized for signs of bias or favoritism. She had enlisted the help of every woman in the settlement, and together they had created an environment that honored both white and Indian concepts of formal proceedings. The entire settlement had taken on the atmosphere of a carnival and a wake simultaneously, as people arrived from neighboring homesteads and trading posts to witness history in the making. Cowboys rode in from distant ranches, their curiosity overcoming their usual reluctance to involve themselves in matters that didn't directly affect their livestock or their wages. Homesteading families arrived in wagons loaded with children and camping supplies, turning the trial into an unexpected social gathering that brought together people who might otherwise never have reason to meet. Captain Thornfield had used the delay to gather additional evidence and witnesses, sending riders to Fort Collins and other military installations to collect testimony about the raid that had precipitated the current crisis. What they brought back painted a picture of a carefully planned attack on a cavalry supply train that had resulted in the deaths of 7 soldiers and the theft of weapons and ammunition that could arm an entire war party. The evidence was damning in its thoroughness, documenting not only the immediate casualties, but also the broader strategic implications of the successful raid. But the military investigation had also uncovered details that complicated the simple narrative of Indian aggression that Captain Thornfield had initially accepted. The supply train had been carrying weapons far in excess of what would normally be distributed to frontier settlements for defensive purposes, including artillery pieces and enough ammunition to outfit a small army. More troubling still were reports from other officers that suggested the weapons were intended not for legitimate defense, but for offensive operations designed to drive Indian tribes from lands that were supposedly protected by federal treaties. Chenoa had spent the time preparing her own defense with the help of Dakota Red Wolf and the other Lakota warriors who had remained camped outside the settlement. Through long conversations conducted in their native language, she had reconstructed the events that led to the raid and the tragic ambush that followed, piecing together a narrative that revealed the complexity of a conflict that could not be reduced to simple categories of right and wrong. Her story, when it finally emerged, would challenge everything that both sides believed about the nature of the war they were fighting. Young Ethan had appointed himself as an unofficial liaison between the various parties, moving freely among the soldiers, settlers, and Indians with the fearless curiosity of childhood. His presence seemed to ease tensions and facilitate communication in ways that surprised even the adults who had grown accustomed to his precocious wisdom. He had developed a particular fascination with Dakota Red Wolf, asking endless questions about Lakota customs and traditions that the war chief answered with patient amusement and growing respect for the boy's intelligence. On the morning of the trial, the entire population of Henderson Stop and surrounding areas had gathered in and around the trading post, creating an audience that included cowboys, homesteaders, soldiers, Indians, and various other frontier characters who had come to witness what many were calling the most important legal proceeding in the history of the territory. The atmosphere was tense but respectful, as if everyone present understood the significance of what was about to unfold and the precedent it might set for future conflicts. Reverend Morrison called the proceedings to order with a prayer that asked for wisdom and justice while acknowledging the pain and loss that had brought them all together. His words were carefully chosen to honor both Christian and Indian concepts of divine guidance, creating a spiritual framework that transcended denominational boundaries. Chief White Bear followed with a traditional Lakota blessing that honored the spirits of the dead and asked for guidance in finding a path toward healing and reconciliation. Captain Thornfield presented his case first, methodically laying out the evidence of the cavalry supply train raid with the precision of a man trained in military efficiency. He called witnesses who testified to the planning and execution of the attack, the specific weapons that were stolen, and the identities of the soldiers who had died in the engagement. His presentation was thorough and professional, painting Chenoa as a key participant in an act of war that demanded military justice according to established military law and custom. But when Dakota Red Wolf rose to present Chenoa's defense, the narrative began to shift in ways that revealed the deeper complexities of the conflict. Through careful questioning and the testimony of Lakota witnesses, he established that the cavalry supply train had been carrying weapons intended for distribution to white settlers who were encroaching on treaty-protected Indian lands. The raid, he argued, was not an act of aggression, but a defensive measure designed to prevent the arming of hostile civilians who threatened Lakota families and villages. Chenoa's own testimony proved to be the most compelling and controversial element of the trial. Speaking in clear, measured English that carried the weight of deep conviction, she described the escalating cycle of violence that had consumed her people and the desperate circumstances that had led to the decision to attack the supply train. But she also spoke of the ambush that had killed her brother and 14 other warriors, describing in heartbreaking detail the systematic execution of wounded men who had been trying to surrender. I do not ask you to forgive the deaths of the soldiers who fell in our raid, she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom like the wind across the prairie. War is war, and death comes to all who choose to fight. But I ask you to understand that we fought not from hatred, but from the same love of family and home that drives your own soldiers to take up arms. We sought to protect our children from weapons that would be used to drive us from the only land we have ever known. Young Ethan's testimony proved to be the most unexpected and powerful element of the entire trial. Called by Sarah McKinney to speak about Chenoa's behavior during her stay at the boarding house, the boys' simple, honest account of their interactions painted a picture of a grieving woman struggling with loss and guilt rather than a hardened war criminal plotting future attacks. "She cried when she talked about her brother," Ethan said with the directness that only children could manage. "And she told me stories about when they were kids together. Bad people don't cry about the people they love, and they don't tell gentle stories to children they just met." As the testimony concluded and the judges retired to deliberate, the crowd outside the trading post settled into an uneasy quiet that seemed to stretch across the entire settlement like a held breath. Soldiers and Indians maintained their separate camps, but individuals from both groups found themselves drawn into conversations that would have been unthinkable just days before. The trial had created a space for dialogue that transcended the usual boundaries of race and conflict. The deliberation lasted until well into the evening, as Reverend Morrison and Chief White Bear wrestled with questions that had no easy answers and precedents that offered little guidance. When they finally emerged from their private discussions, their faces bore the weight of decisions that would affect not only Chenoa's fate, but the future relationship between the military, the settlers, and the various Indian tribes of the region. Reverend Morrison rose to deliver the verdict with the solemnity appropriate to a moment that everyone present understood would be remembered for generations. "We find," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom, "that Chenoa White Dove participated in the raid on the cavalry supply train as charged. However, we also find that this action was taken in defense of her people's treaty rights and in response to provocation that threatened the safety of Lakota families and villages. We therefore sentence her to time served during her recovery, contingent upon her agreement to serve as a liaison between her people and the territorial government to prevent future conflicts." The verdict satisfied no one completely, but it offered something to all parties involved. Captain Thornfield obtained acknowledgement of military authority and Chenoa's guilt, while avoiding the diplomatic disaster that her execution would have created. The Lakota delegation achieved recognition of their defensive motivations and secured Chenoa's freedom to return to her people. The settlers of Henderson's Stop demonstrated that frontier justice could be both firm and merciful when guided by wisdom rather than vengeance. As the crowd began to disperse and the various parties prepared to return to their normal lives, young Ethan found himself standing beside Chenoa on the porch of the trading post, watching the sun set over the prairie that had witnessed so much conflict and was now experiencing an unexpected moment of peace. "Will you come back and visit us?" he asked with the directness that had characterized all their conversations. "I'd like to hear more stories about your brother and your people." Chenoa looked down at the boy who had shown her kindness when she expected only hatred, who had defended her when she had no right to expect protection, who had helped create a bridge between two worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. "Yes, little warrior," she said, with the first genuine smile that had crossed her face since the massacre at Crow Creek. "I will return. There are more stories to tell, and perhaps new ones to create together." The settlement of Henderson's Stop returned to its normal routines in the days that followed, but something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the various peoples who called the frontier home. The trial had demonstrated that justice and mercy were not mutually exclusive, that understanding and forgiveness were possible even in the aftermath of violence and loss. It was a lesson that would echo across the territory for years to come, inspiring other communities to seek alternatives to the cycle of revenge that had consumed so many lives. And in the years that followed, when travelers passed through Henderson's Stop and asked about the unusual mixture of peoples who seemed to coexist there in relative harmony, the locals would tell them about the day when a wounded Sioux woman arrived seeking help and found something more precious than medicine or shelter. She found proof that the human capacity for compassion could overcome even the deepest divisions, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships could bloom in the harshest soil, nurtured by nothing more than the courage to choose understanding over hatred. The story of Chenoa White Dove and young Ethan Burke became legend throughout the territory, but for those who lived it, it remained something simpler and more profound, a reminder that in a world torn by conflict and division, there were still people willing to risk everything for the radical notion that all human beings deserved mercy, dignity, and the chance for redemption. Sometimes the greatest victories were not won with guns and glory, but with gentle hands and open hearts, proving that love truly was stronger than hatred, and that hope could flourish even in the darkest of times. 2 years had passed since the unprecedented trial at Henderson's Stop, and the frontier had changed in ways that few could have predicted when Captain Thornfield first rode into the settlement with arrest warrants and military authority. Trading Post had evolved into something entirely unexpected, a neutral meeting ground where disputes between settlers, soldiers, and various Indian tribes were resolved through negotiation rather than violence. Chenoa White Dove had kept her promise to serve as a liaison, traveling regularly between her people's camps and the white settlements, carrying messages and mediating conflicts that might otherwise have erupted into bloodshed. Young Ethan Burke, now 10 years old and taller by nearly a foot, had become something of a local celebrity throughout the territory. His role in creating the peaceful resolution had made him a symbol of hope for those who believed that the cycle of frontier violence could be broken through understanding and compromise. He had learned to speak basic Lakota from his frequent conversations with Chenoa and the other Indian visitors who now came regularly to Henderson's Stop for trade and diplomacy. On this particular autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted down from the cottonwood trees that lined the creek behind the settlement, Ethan sat on the familiar porch steps of the trading post, carving a piece of wood with the same knife his father had given him years before. The skill had come from hours of instruction by Dakota Red Wolf, who visited the settlement monthly to check on his cousin and to participate in the ongoing peace negotiations. The sound of approaching riders drew Ethan's attention to the eastern horizon, where a dust cloud announced the arrival of what appeared to be a large group of travelers. But as the riders drew closer, the boy's experienced eyes picked out details that made him frown with concern. These were not the usual mixed groups of traders and settlers that had become common at Henderson's Stop. Instead, he saw a disciplined formation of perhaps 30 white men, all heavily armed and riding with the grim purposefulness of a military unit on a mission. Ethan set down his carving and walked quickly into the trading post, where his father was discussing supply orders with Sarah McKinney and Doc Slattery. "Pa," he said quietly, "we've got riders coming in from the east. Looks like trouble. They're riding hard and they're all carrying rifles." His voice carried the calm authority of a child who had learned to read the signs of impending conflict with the accuracy of an experienced scout. Big Jim Henderson looked up from his paperwork, his face immediately growing serious as he absorbed his son's report. 2 years of peace had not made him careless, and he understood that the fragile harmony they had achieved at Henderson's Stop was always just one incident away from collapse. "How many?" he asked, already moving toward the rifle rack behind the counter. 30, maybe more," Ethan replied, following his father outside where they could get a better view of the approaching riders. "They're flying a flag, but it's not military. Looks like some kind of militia. And Faye, they've got someone tied up and riding with them. Looks like a prisoner." The boy's voice carried a note of worry that reflected his growing understanding of the complexities of frontier justice. The approaching riders resolved themselves into a grim procession, led by a man whose bearing and equipment marked him as someone accustomed to command and violence. Colonel James Whitmore was a name that had become notorious throughout the territory over the past year, as leader of a volunteer militia that claimed to be protecting white settlers from Indian raids, but had gained a reputation for brutal tactics that often targeted peaceful tribes and mixed-race settlements. The prisoner riding bound and gagged in the center of the militia formation was immediately recognizable to anyone who had spent time at Henderson's Stop during the past 2 years. Joseph Crow Feather was Chenoa's 15-year-old nephew, a boy who had been learning English and white customs as part of his aunt's efforts to build bridges between the two cultures. His presence as a captive suggested that the peaceful era was about to end in the most violent way possible. Colonel Whitmore dismounted from his black stallion with the fluid grace of a career soldier, his uniform bearing the dust and stains of hard travel, but his bearing remaining crisp and authoritative. He was perhaps 45 years old, with graying hair and eyes the color of winter steel, and he carried himself with the confident authority of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of force. "I am Colonel James Whitmore, commanding the Territorial Volunteer Militia," he announced in a voice that carried clearly across the settlement, drawing people from their homes and businesses to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. "I'm here under the authority of the Territorial Governor to arrest known Indian sympathizers and to investigate reports of illegal collaboration with hostile tribes. This settlement has been identified as a center of such activities." Big Jim Henderson stepped forward to meet the colonel, his massive frame posing even next to the mounted militia members who remained in formation behind their leader. "Colonel," he said with cautious politeness, "welcome to Henderson's Stop. I'm Jim Henderson, and I own this establishment. What specific charges are you bringing, and against whom?" His tone was neutral, giving away nothing while seeking information. Colonel Whitmore studied Big Jim with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to assess potential opponents quickly and accurately. "Mr. Henderson," he said without preamble, "this settlement has been providing aid and comfort to known Indian war criminals, including the woman known as Chenoa White Dove, who was responsible for the deaths of 7 cavalry soldiers 2 years ago. We have reliable intelligence that she continues to operate from this location, planning further attacks against white settlements." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and Ethan could feel the tension that suddenly gripped every person within hearing distance. The peaceful coexistence that had defined Henderson's Stop for the past 2 years was being challenged by forces that had no interest in compromise or understanding. Doc Slattery appeared from the boarding house, his medical bag in hand and his face bearing the expression of a man who had seen enough of violence to recognize its approach from a considerable distance. "Colonel," he said with the authoritative voice of someone who had held the same rank during a more legitimate war, "I was present during the legal proceedings that resolved the charges against Chenoa White Dove 2 years ago. She was tried by civilian and military authorities working together, and she was sentenced to serve as a peace liaison." But Colonel Whitmore's response revealed that he had not come to Henderson's Stop seeking dialogue or clarification. "Doctor," he said with barely concealed contempt, "that kangaroo court had no legal authority to dispose of military charges against an enemy combatant. The woman is still wanted under military law, and anyone who has assisted her since that illegal proceeding is subject to charges of harboring a fugitive." Young Ethan, who had been listening to the exchange with growing alarm, suddenly stepped forward despite his father's sharp gesture for him to stay back. "Mister," he said with the directness that had served him well in previous confrontations, with adult authority, "that boy you've got tied up hasn't done anything wrong. His name is Joseph, and he's been learning to read and write English so he can help his people understand white laws and customs. He's not a warrior or a criminal. He's just a kid like me." The colonel turned his attention to the boy who had dared to interrupt adult conversation, his eyes narrowing as he took in Ethan's obvious comfort with Indian names and customs. "Son," he said with deceptive mildness, "it sounds like you've been spending too much time with the wrong kind of people. This boy we captured was carrying messages between hostile tribes, making him a spy and a legitimate target for military action." But Ethan's response revealed how much he had learned from his friendship with Chenoa and his exposure to the complexities of frontier diplomacy. If he was carrying messages, the boy said with uncomfortable logic, then maybe you should read them before you decide he's a spy. Maybe he was carrying messages about peace talks or trade agreements. You don't know until you look. The wisdom in the child's words was undeniable, but Colonel Whitmore's pride and his commitment to a particular worldview made it impossible for him to acknowledge the validity of arguments that came from a boy who had clearly been corrupted by Indian influence. "That's enough," he said sharply. "This settlement is under military authority as of this moment, and all residents will submit to questioning about their activities and associations." As the situation escalated toward violence, Sarah McKinney emerged from the boarding house, carrying her shotgun with the familiar ease of a woman who had learned to defend herself and her property without relying on others for protection. Behind her came Martha Henderson and several other women of the settlement, all armed and all wearing expressions that suggested they had no intention of allowing their community to be destroyed by outside forces. "Colonel," Sarah said with the deceptive calm of a woman who had buried one husband and was not intimidated by threats from another man in uniform, "this is a civilian settlement operating under territorial law. You have no authority here without proper warrants signed by civilian magistrates. I suggest you state your business clearly and conduct it lawfully, or remove yourself and your men from our property." The confrontation that was building between the militia and the residents of Henderson's stop represented more than just a dispute over legal authority or the fate of individual prisoners. It was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of what the frontier could become. One based on the assumption that peace was possible only through the complete subjugation of Indian peoples, and another based on the radical notion that different cultures could coexist when guided by mutual respect and understanding. Young Ethan Burke, standing at the center of the growing conflict, understood instinctively that the next few minutes would determine not only the fate of Joseph Crow Feather and the other people he cared about, but the future of everything they had worked to build at Henderson's stop. As Colonel Whitmore's hand moved toward his sidearm, and the militia members behind him shifted their weapons into more threatening positions, the boy who had once offered friendship to a wounded enemy was about to discover whether the lessons he had learned about courage and compassion would be enough to prevent the destruction of the only home he had ever known.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.